All right, so let's get started with Module 1. Corey Hines, Ward Ralston, what's new in Windows Server 2016? Take a quick look at, what is new in Windows Server 2016? What are the major new things, the major new categories, and just at a high level, what's been introduced in this version of Windows Server? So our agenda for this module, take a look at, what customers came back and told Microsoft. So, based on what feedback, what scenarios, what challenges are all these new features based on? And then we'll look at some built-in security capabilities, how Azure has inspired the infrastructure, and coming down from Azure to Windows Server for on-prem deployment, look at some hosted sort of hybrid application models for the platform and how we're deploying applications now. And then finally, what the next steps, the recommendations are for you to go on and go ahead and learn more. So we'll begin with what Microsoft heard from customers. And this can kind of be broadly categorized into three areas: security, the software-defined data center, and then the application platform. So with in terms of security, three things that became very prevalent as Microsoft collected feedback. One of them, there's an increasing number of breaches or security incidents that are happening all the time. And a lot of those incidents are based on targeting identity.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I was just looking up in preparation for this. The Identity Theft Research Center last year, 2015, 781 identified data breaches last year, which was the highest number since 2005 when they started recording. And, it's not starting to be business anymore. Like, huge data breaches across, medical, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as financial sectors as well. And, a lot of identity or breaches, they go unreported. So, take that biggest year we had and think about, maybe the 40% that weren't even reported. Security, which hasn't been, on the front burner for a lot of IT pros in the past, is now becoming a hot and heavy topic. And as we're going to see, Windows Server 2016 really has some innovative features that are being introduced to target these exact scenarios.
One of the other pieces of feedback was that securing virtual environments is increasingly becoming more and more complex, especially as we have multi-tenant virtual environments where there's this separation between what's often referred to as the fabric administrator and the service or the application administrator. And so these are two terms that you're going to hear quite a bit: fabric administration, service administration. Fabric administration being you're the guy that's responsible for the physical layer that everything ultimately runs on: storage, networking, and compute. And the service administrator being, you're the guy that deploys the applications on top of that fabric. And so, if securing one from the other, so the application administrator cannot manage the fabric, and the fabric administrator, now that he has, and this is a kind of a key one, access to the physical data center, how do you protect the resources in that data center from the guy that has physical access to it? Yeah. We then move into the software-defined data center, which is, in a lot of cases, the way that this is solved. So, customers came back and said, well, there's a lack of integration between all my different components. I have many different types of hardware, many different types of vendors. They don't all talk together. They don't all work together very well. And as a result, it's hard to deploy and operate. And in many cases, what I'm deploying are server roles, and the server footprint's too big. Give me a smaller version of Windows. Give me a lighter version of Windows. Give me a purpose-built version of Windows, which is ultimately where the new nano server technology came from. And then finally, on the application side, we want quick integration between developers and operations, this term DevOps. And that integration is kind of lacking today, and it's making it difficult to plan for eventual migration to public cloud. So, ultimately, these are the big things that customers came back and said. So we'll take a look at the way that, Windows Server now begins to address those. And so with security, with infrastructure, and with the hybrid application platform, there's many different technologies that Windows Server 2016 has introduced to address these very specific customer needs. We'll take a second and kind of talk about what these different technologies are. First off, on the security side, a couple of major things that have happened. Number one, actually jump ahead and look at for identity with credentials. So with credentials, we have the notion of something called Credential Guard. Credential Guard was introduced with Windows 10 and uses a virtualization-based technology, essentially a kind of a specialized VM to be able to protect credentials that are stored on the system. Ordinarily, credentials are stored in memory on the system. If we introduce the boundary of a virtual machine, a kind of special virtual machine, it makes it much harder for malware malicious software, malicious administrators to now go in and steal credentials. Right? Another common problem, just enough administration, just in time administration. How often have, in the past, for example, you take an administrator and they come in and they need to perform a task, so you make them, say, a domain admin, and then you forget to remove them.
Or you accidentally delete that OU, or,
right. Yeah, I mean, they become an administrator, and they're an administrator forever.
That's right.
I know you've done in the past, you've done security audits on companies.
Yep.
And you go in, you look, and you see, well, there's 40 people in the domain admins group, and you find out, well, it was because 3 years ago they had to do something that required it, and we just forgot to remove it.
And they're walking around the entire network with that token all day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with Windows Server 2016, there's 2 new security technologies that have been introduced that allow you to take the capability of an administrator and reduce it from all they need to do, all privileges all the time, to just what they need for a limited period of time.
Right.
So you become an admin for the next 3 hours to accomplish your task, and after that, your credentials automatically lose that right. So very key for long-term protection, to kind of take away that notion of, oh, I forgot to remove them from the security group. I forgot to take away those permissions. They all become time-based. Then, well, in addition to that, protecting the OS regardless of where it is, whether it's in a private cloud or a public cloud, and taking some of the knowledge that has been learned on Azure and bringing that down to Windows Server 2016. I mean, you may be surprised to learn, but people attack Azure.
I'm sure it's under constant attack.
They attack Azure all the time, and so Microsoft has had to develop some very special technology to basically model what they consider effective or correct behavior of operating systems. And if you find something that doesn't match correct behavior, take an action to block it. And the result are things like control flow guard and enhancements to Windows Defender, and then advanced code integrity policies to make sure that, for example, if a machine boots, it boots using the right kernel code. It hasn't been, use the term rootkit a lot.
Yep.
There has been a rootkit applied that modifies the kernel somehow to get, below the hypervisor at that very, very low level. And these are all things that were developed, tested, tried, and proven in Azure, and have now been brought down to Windows Server.
Yeah, and I would add a quick note on this Windows Defender. For those of you who are going to download Technical Preview 5, as Corey mentioned, this is about as close as you get to the release before the actual release comes out. So, being feature complete, this is an excellent time to download and start kicking the tires. On the Windows Defender side, in Technical Preview 5, this is enabled by default. Defender, and you actually have to install the through the add remove features, the actual console to actually turn it on and off if you want. Just heads up, it's installed not by default.
So great tip, thanks. So then we move on to what is there for virtual machines? Well, now we introduce this notion of what's called a shielded VM. In previous versions, we had the notion of a BitLocker encrypted VM. So I could take my VM and I could use BitLocker technology, and I could fully encrypt that VM. The idea is that, hey, if you get physical access to the machine and you steal the VHD, you can now, it's as if you walked into the data center and pulled the hard drive. You have physical access, you own it. Well, we want to change that, right? If you have physical access, maybe you don't own it. Maybe you can't go in and crack the database and get the passwords. So BitLocker protected VMs use BitLocker encryption to make sure that VHD files are encrypted to the same level of BitLocker, and you can't go in, steal the VHD, crack it open, get the passwords.
And what we're doing here with the technology, and I think you're going to see this theme a lot in Server 2016, virtualizing network, virtualizing storage. We've been virtualizing hardware for years now, and the technology that really makes the shielded VM happen is actually virtualizing that trusted platform module chip that's normally associated on the hardware. We can now bring that into the VM and hence, leverage BitLocker to encrypt it.
So you may ask the question, well, how do I deploy BitLocker across an entire enterprise? How do I, take that to mass scale? And the answer is there's a new component within Windows Server called the Host Guardian service. It's a complete infrastructure that you deploy. You actually deploy a separate forest to hold your keys.
Encrypting the fabric.
You create a trust with that forest, and you create what's known as a protected fabric, so that every Hyper-V host can get its BitLocker keys from a central location, deploy what are called shielded VMs, which are encrypted VMs. They can move from host to host to host with the same flexibility as a normal virtual machine on a normal fabric, but while maintaining that same level of encryption.
Right.
Okay. And then finally, we have Generation 2 VMs. Now, Generation 2 VMs are not necessarily a new thing, but it's a Generation 2 VM that enables things like BitLocker encryption, TPMs, and this host guardian service to work properly.
This is an important thing, though. Again, when I think about, that Windows Server 08 administrator, and, when I think about any data center, I can't imagine them, being all 2012 R2, without a little bit of 08 in there. So, for you 08 administrators out there, for you guys with 08 in your data center, pay attention to the Gen 2 VMs as you look to upgrade to the next version, because there's a lot of capabilities that get unlocked when you switch to, what is it, UEFI?
UEFI.
UEFI.
So it's instead of a PC-based BIOS,
right,
or an SMB, the old American Megatrends that was on.
Phoenix BIOS?
Yeah, exactly. Every CRT monitor ever turned on. It's a UEFI BIOS. It's a much more intelligent BIOS. So take a look at the slide real quick. We see that, we've kind of moved the bar a little bit to where, if you were a server administrator and the servers were locked in a physical building you didn't have access to, you could have managed the server but not manage any of the fabric in the platform. As we move to VMs, which is kind of where we are today, if you're the server administrator, you can now manage the storage, the network, the backups, everything, right? Because it's all files. It's not physical, it's files.
Right.
With Shielded, we can now be a VM administrator, so I can manage the fabric, but not have access to the server, the storage, the network, or the backup. So we're kind of moving that bar to make sure that you as an administrator have access to only what you need, only when you need it. And then, there's a lot of additional built-in security features. We kind of have sort of a plethora here of, what all these different sort of features are. You see things like secure boot, you see things like nano server, you see things like containers, code integrity checks. There's a lot of work being done to make sure that the knowledge and the security from running Azure has been brought down, rolled into Windows Server 2016, so you have all that same knowledge, intelligence, and capability just in a smaller package you can deploy on your own.
Yeah, I'm looking at it through that 08 lens, I would definitely personally be paying attention to the shielded virtual machines as well as the Hyper-V containers. I mean, to me, those are going to be a couple of features that really make moving off of 08 into, 2016 very compelling.
So our next sort of theme is we talk about what's called Azure-inspired infrastructure. As Microsoft has deployed Azure, I think you made a comment to me a couple of days ago, the world's largest supercomputer.
Let me jump on my little soapbox here about Azure, because I get personally a little excited when I talk about it, or when I tell people about it. Azure is commodity hardware, literally just deployed across the planet. We have over 100 data centers, offer Azure services in over 140 countries, and we run 200 of our own services on there. Think of Xbox, Office, Outlook, Hotmail, Office 365. I mean, and in these data centers, we have over 1 million servers around the world that we have gotten excellent at managing ever since we opened our first data center in 1989. And since then, have spent over $15 billion in investing in data center and how to highly automate the compute, network, and storage across these million computers. So when we say, we're taking some of our learnings that we have, that we have brought from these 200 plus services that Microsoft runs highly reliably down into the data center, while at the same time, we have 20 years of momentum that we are putting behind all the technologies in the Windows Server. We really have, in my opinion, Windows Server 2016 is the best of both worlds, not only to do best of breed on premises, but also start dipping your toe in the cloud if you haven't already. These Azure-inspired features, or infrastructure, as we like to call it, is going to more increasingly allow you to seamlessly bring your on-premises up into Azure. Okay, I'm off my soapbox.
So as we think about that, the biggest thing when you start moving to hyperscale is obviously downtime. You have to find ways to prevent downtime, to mitigate downtime, to eliminate downtime. And what Microsoft has done with Windows Server 2016 is given you the ability to virtualize virtually anything, no pun intended, and eliminate all those needs for downtime that come from, the not so obvious scenarios, such as patches and reboots, such as cluster upgrades, right? Which was a big pain point going from 2008 to 2022, especially for those that had invested heavily in virtualization, because you had to incur downtime to do that. And then things like, I need more networks, I need more disk, I need more storage, I need more memory. Yes, we have dynamic memory, but now we have things like hot add and remove hard drives, disks, and memory. We'll take a look at some of that as we move into
not just Microsoft technologies. I think that's an important point too. We offer that same type of potential for Linux operating systems too.
Absolutely.
Hot add, remove.
There's a number of years ago, there's kind of a trend towards Linux, and it kind of, I don't want to say died down, but it kind of got quiet for a while. And now there's a big, Linux is kind of in the forefront of everybody's mind again, to the point that Windows 10 has a bash shell on it now. Microsoft is truly embracing the Linux world and the Linux community, making it a first-class citizen both in Azure, also on Windows Server, and embracing technologies that traditionally come from a Linux world, like containers, the Docker engine, for example. So, for example, we mentioned rolling cluster upgrades, the Linux support hot add remove hardware, and then in terms of placing your workloads, there's some new network technology we'll talk about. The network controller, which is a new component to Windows Server 2016 that was inspired directly from Azure to centrally manage all elements of your physical network: switches, routers, top of rack switches, load balancers, and then also virtualized component like virtual switches. And then introducing the notion of a distributed firewall. The distributed firewall is a term that it's a little vague. We'll explain it when we talk about the networking, but it's this idea that if you have an application and that application requires a certain port to be open, and that application runs in a virtual machine, as that virtual machine moves around the data center, as you move it from host to host or from data center to data center, the rules that ensure it has connectivity, such as open firewalls, open ports, follow the workload. And if that means we've got to reconfigure switches, we've got to reconfigure routers, we need to create firewall rules, all that happens automatically as that workload moves around, and you as the administrator don't need to remember that, hey, if we put the sales app in data center 2, someone's got to remember to open the port in the firewall or it's not going to work. That all now happens automatically as part of the network controller.
Would you say it's fair to say that with network controller, you really are creating a network fabric within your organization?
I would, but I wouldn't put it that way. With the network controller, you're now via software and policy able to fully manage that network fabric.
Okay,
so
that's a better way to look at it.
You don't have to, understand how to configure the Cisco switch versus the Dell switch versus the HP switch.
Right.
You can simply say have a policy, and the network controller can now go into all those different switches, assuming they support industry standard configuration protocols, and make those configuration changes for you.
Cool.
So then we take a look at storage.
Oh, your favorite.
Honestly, it truly is. I come from a storage background. I love storage.
I love the way you light up when you talk about it.
I know. It gets
it's like watching paint dry for most people, but yeah.
Oh, for me, it's like watching bits move on a disk. So, most IT pros in the Windows ecosystem are familiar with storage spaces. It's Windows. I say this very, very loosely. It's Windows' built-in version of RAID. So everyone knows what RAID is: RAID 5, RAID 10, etc. And then with Windows, they had Sofware RAID and Windows NT and Windows 2000 and so on. And then with Windows Server 2008, or was it R2? One of them, they introduced storage spaces, which was sort of an upgraded version. Now we have distributed storage spaces, and this is kind of a fun one. It enables you to have multiple commodity servers with no shared storage, configured as a single storage pool. So it's a RAID array that spans physical servers. So think of, with RAID array, you have 5 disks and your parity is on 1 disk. With Storage Spaces Direct, you have 5 servers and your parity is on 1 server. Now, in reality, it's not that, but that conceptually, it's kind of like that. And so we'll see an example of how to build a hyper-converged cluster, which is a cluster that runs VMs with full shared storage and parity, but without any networking, with any shared storage, I just said it uses shared storage. I'm saying it doesn't use shared storage.
Yeah, I don't want to get too ahead.
You'll get to the point when you see it.
I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, because I know we have other modules where we're going to go a lot deeper on this. But for those people maybe just picking up one module here, I think you mentioned to me the other day that there is this transformation going on even with the IT professional, right? The IT professional used to have a SAN administrator, used to have a security administrator, used to have a domain administrator, and in a weird way, not to overuse a term, but they're also being hyper-converged into one person now because of the capabilities in the product make it so easy. You don't need a guy with a degree from MIT to set up a fiber channel, right? You just get a box with a bunch of disks, commodity hardware, which is what Azure uses. Right off the shelf, x86 infrastructure, and now with the promise of the technology to do these complex tasks for you, the role of the IT administrator is becoming more complex with a lot more
Yeah,
responsibilities.
I use the term a fabric administrator and a workload administrator.
Yeah.
So the fabric administrator does networking, virtualization, and storage.
Okay.
And in the past, if you were doing storage, you typically, let's say you deployed a very high-end storage array, you bought it from one of these big companies, EMC, Dell, any one of those,
Right.
any one of those big companies. You had to learn how to use it. It was complex. There's a lot of work to it, and it's very specialized because essentially a SAN has its own little operating system. You got to know how to configure it. Well, you can now take all that knowledge and that work, and Windows does it for you. So the skills you use to create a file share are now the skills you use to deploy a SAN.
Right.
And so those kinds of tasks are becoming accessible to the mainstream Windows administrator. The result is it's simpler and easier, and we'll see that as we're going through. So a lot of these capabilities that come from what we refer to as Azure-inspired infrastructure. You can see a pretty long list here. The things that Microsoft does in Azure, we want to enable those to run on-prem and make the transition from Azure to on-prem and from on-prem to Azure simple, seamless, and easy.
Yeah, and again, I always like to look at these lists again from that, if I were, an 08 or, other type of previous version of Windows, I would say for me, network controller stands out as a feature to really pay attention to. And I always have to give a shout out to PowerShell. Like, as you think about that, the new role of the IT pro or the IT administrator, there's less and less you're going to be able to do without PowerShell. And I think a good example we'll see is like, if you want to put, group policy doesn't work on NanoServer. If you want to do any type of policy, you need to use desired state configuration through PowerShell. It's just becoming a tool you need to know more and more and more about as we get into more versions of Windows.
Absolutely. So taking a look at hybrid application platform, what that means. There's two major things we'll kind of talk about in here. NanoServer as a deployment option. So the idea be that if you want to deploy a workload, you deploy the minimum amount of Windows as possible and the minimum amount of application infrastructure as possible so that your application is as light and portable as possible. And so NanoServer was developed for that reason. NanoServer is a version of Windows that is below Server Core. So if you're familiar with Server Core, it's less than Server Core.
20 times less.
It's very, very lightweight. You deploy the entire thing in a couple of hundred meg. You can't really modify it once it's been deployed. You kind of pick the roles and features you want, you build it, and you set it up, and it boots in seconds, uses very little memory, and it's just enough to run applications. And one of the applications it's very good at running at is the container technology, which is container technology is an application deployment model that's less than a virtual machine, but more than running, say, multiple web apps on a single machine. So it gives you a level of isolation and a level of portability that's been fairly common. It's very common in cloud providers that are out there existing today. And so a lot of developers are looking to use container technology to kind of circumvent some of the problems that happen when you go from a developer workstation, to a test and staging server, to a deployment production server, and all the the configuration changes that have happened. I deploy the application, but we're missing a file. We need to deploy the file. Containers solve, if used properly, solve many of those issues. And so we have containers, which are traditional, which are kind of the new minimal workload. We have traditional VM workloads that can run on Server Core, and then we have full applications that require the GUI that can run on RDS. So you have all these different tiers that you can choose from as an application developer on how you want to deploy it. Windows has traditionally been the big one. Virtual machines, Server Core introduced the one in the middle, and now we have NanoServer and containers, which is the smallest, simplest, most lightweight version.
I mean, the little nerd point here. Jeffrey Snover's blog just the other day was talking about how NanoServer doesn't use the MSI installer technology anymore. It uses the same technology to install that. It's AppX, I believe. It's the same technology that's used to install things from the Microsoft Store. So really kind of flipped it on its head how we even look at the install of Windows Server.
Everything is looked at very differently. So we mentioned containers, right? What is a container? A container is a boundary within the system that is less overhead than a virtual machine and provides essentially a read-only view of the operating system with a mechanism to capture changes as well, but a read-only view of the operating system where you can actually run an application. So I can run multiple copies of the same application in multiple containers on the same host with minimal overhead. if you compare this to virtual machines, because for most IT administrators, they get confused between virtual machines and containers, and they think of, they hear the term Hyper-V container and Windows Server container, virtual machine, and what really is the difference between them. A Hyper-V container and a Windows Server container are both containers, they're just different deployment models. A Hyper-V container will use the hypervisor to create additional isolation, whereas a Windows Server container will not use the hypervisor for that additional level of isolation. In both cases, it's still just a container, and a container is a boundary in which you can run an application. A good analogy for, if you're an existing IT pro administrator, a good analogy is AppV or Server AppV. When you spin up an application in AppV, it creates a little virtual bubble the application runs in where it doesn't conflict with anything else. And it's got its own view of the files in the operating system, and it can contain its own configuration. But you start the application, it's in a virtualized bubble. When you're done with the application, the bubble goes away.
Right.
A container works in a similar conceptual manner. You start a container, it's isolated. You stop a container, it goes away. You don't back up containers. You don't live migrate containers. You don't, save containers. A container is an instantiated version of a container image, much like an AppV application is an instantiated version of an AppV.
See, when I've tried to explain containers to a few people, and until you explained the way that AppV, acts similarly the same way as a container, it's when that was like my aha moment. It's like, okay, I get it now.
Yeah. And then you say, well, how does it relate to a virtual machine? A virtual machine has the entire operating system, its own copy of the operating system.
Yeah.
A container doesn't. A container uses the host's copy of the operating system for operating system functions. Yeah. And so we've got a whole module when we talk about the application platform that deal with containers a little bit later on. And so you can see there's a lot of things that represent this new sort of hybrid application platform. Containers, full integration with Docker. Docker is a sort of an industry standard container engine and containers set of commands for manipulating and managing containers.
Yeah.
And Microsoft has full Docker support on Windows Server 2016.
That's right.
You can create containers with Docker commands or with the PowerShell provider. PowerShell desired state configuration. Rather than scripting the flow of making configuration changes, you merely describe the desired end state. And the system figures out how to make those changes for you. If you want a service started with PowerShell DSC, you say, make this service start. And PowerShell takes care of the work for you. You don't have to query the state of the service. And then,
right.
If
it's a push-pull.
Yeah, if stop, start, if not, ignore.
One of the interesting things, though, about this desired state configuration, and it was also in Jeffrey Snover's blog, that, increasingly Microsoft is going to start to move away from group policy, especially when it relates to servers. I mean, it's great for client configuration. There's a bunch of new group policy management tools put in just for Windows 10. But as we're seeing with Nano Server, it needs to be managed through desired state configuration with PowerShell. And as the server world evolves, that's going to be increasingly become the case.
Well, ultimately, if you think about group policy requires that you be in a domain on a LAN.
Yeah,
right?
You also have to have,
ultimately, that's
right.
The fundamental environmental requirement for group policy is I've got a domain,
yep.
I've got a local area network, and I've got that, I'm inside the firewall on the LAN type connectivity.
Yeah.
Increasingly, that's not the case for how companies are deploying workloads.
Right.
For example, if you're a company today and you're starting up right now, you're probably putting your application on the cloud. You're probably embracing bring your own device. Mm-hmm. So rather than domain joined machines, you have personal machines. If they're not domain joined, you can't use group policy. So moving away from this traditional notion of domain managed, group policy managed machines into servers that are managed through declarative technology like PowerShell.
That's right.
And then policy-based access to resources as opposed to policy-based configuration of systems.
Yeah. So, again, if I were looking at this through the 08 lens, I would say PowerShell, desired state configuration, and of course, containers and Nano
Absolutely.
are definitely the ones to keep an eye on.
PowerShell is always going to be the theme. Nano Server certainly is a big one. So just kind of recap, where we are with Windows Server 2016. A lot of built-in security capabilities, a lot focused around identity, taking the infrastructure that's been powering Azure, bringing that down to Windows Server 2016, building out the software-defined data center and making those capabilities richer and richer. So as you build your data center infrastructure for deploying workloads, you need less and less specialized skill to manage it. You can define policies and let the system worry about the differences between the actual hardware. And then moving towards a hybrid application model with support for containers, with support for Nano Server, DSC, and many other things. So with that, that's kind of our first look at Windows Server 2016 and what's new. We encourage you to go ahead and download the Technical Preview 5 as of today, which is when we're recording this is just become available. Check out the Windows Server blog. There's a really good video series on the blog that was published not too long ago, which is the top 10 new features in Windows Server 2016. And so Matt McSpirit, one of the technical evangelists here at Microsoft, sat down with a number of folks in the product groups and kind of looked at what are the top 10 best features. A lot of them we would have talked about right in here. So you can see some interviews. They talk about in a little more depth on what some of these features are and why they're good. So with that, that's our quick look at Windows Server 2016. And we'll see you with the next module.
Stay tuned for the next modules.